Welcome to CrimePod Castle. I'm so glad to have you all back for our second deep dive in this series, Ghosts of the Past. Today we're going to be talking about a case that really shook India, the murder of journalist Shivani Bhatnagar. It's a story full of betrayal, corruption, and really a desperate attempt to silence the truth.
And what makes this case even more fascinating is that it involves someone you wouldn't expect at all. Ravi Kant Sharma, a high-ranking Indian police service officer, was eventually convicted of orchestrating her murder.
Wow, okay, so let's rewind a bit to late 1990s India. Who was Shivani Bhatnagar and what kind of work was she doing that would make her a target?
So Shivani was kind of a rising star in investigative journalism. She was known for fearlessly pursuing stories, especially stories involving political corruption. She was really digging into things that made some very powerful people very uncomfortable, and her work was getting a lot of attention.
So she was making waves and I imagine ruffling some feathers along the way. And we know that in her line of work, that can be a dangerous combination. How did she and Ravi Kant Sharma even cross paths?
Well, their initial connection was totally professional. Shivani was working on a story, and Sharma, because of his influential position, he had even worked at Interpol and the Prime Minister's office. He was someone she needed to talk to for her story. But at some point, their relationship went from professional to personal.
Okay, and we've seen so many times how things can get messy when personal relationships and these kinds of investigations into corruption overlap. Was there any hard evidence of this personal relationship?
Oh, there was actually quite a bit of evidence suggesting they were close. They had a lot of phone calls between them, which obviously raised eyebrows. And get this, investigators actually found out that Shivani's email password at the time was Ravi Kant.
Yeah, that's definitely not something you expect to see in a strictly professional relationship. So at what point did this seemingly close relationship start to go south?
It seems like the turning point came when Shivani started to threaten Sharma. She claimed she had information that could really hurt his career and even ruin his marriage. It seems like she wasn't happy with whatever arrangement they had anymore, and she was ready to expose his secrets.
I wonder what must have been going through Sharma's mind at that moment, realizing that the woman he was involved with could bring his whole world crashing down. Did he try to reason with her, beg her to stay silent, or did fear just completely take over?
Based on what happened next, it seems like fear and maybe even a disturbing sense of entitlement drove his next move. Remember, this was a man who was used to having power. The thought of losing everything must have been unbearable.
Unbearable to the point of taking a life. It's hard to believe that someone in his position sworn to uphold the law would even think about doing something like that.
And yet that's exactly what the evidence points to. On January 23rd, 1999, Shivani Bhatnagar was brutally murdered in her own apartment.
So take us through that day. How did this carefully constructed facade of power and respect crumble into such a horrific act?
Okay, so Sharma, knowing he was a high-ranking police officer, knew he couldn't be directly involved. So he got 3 associates to help him: Sri Bhagwan, a property dealer; Satya Prakash, a close friend; and Pradeep Sharma, the one who actually carried out the murder. They planned everything very carefully, making sure that Shivani would be alone that day.
It's a chilling reminder that even people in positions of authority can be tempted by darkness, believing they can manipulate and control everything, even life and death. How did they even get into her apartment? Did Shivani suspect anything was wrong?
They used a really simple but effective trick. 2 of them went to Shivani's apartment pretending to be visitors with a message for her husband, Rakesh Bhatnagar. She had no reason to be suspicious, so she let them in. Imagine she probably offered them tea, totally unaware that she was welcoming her killers into her home.
It's a truly terrifying thought, that sense of normalcy shattered in an instant. Could you describe what happened next?
According to what one of the accomplices said, the attack was fast and brutal. One of them held Shivani down while Pradeep Sharma grabbed a knife from her kitchen and stabbed her multiple times. Then they strangled her with an electric wire to make sure she was dead.
It's just staggering the level of violence they used.
Mm-hmm.
It speaks to such a level of rage and desperation.
And as if the brutality wasn't enough, they tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. They ransacked the apartment trying to cover their tracks.
This brings up an important question. Was Shivani's murder a crime of passion, a desperate attempt to protect a secret? Or was there something more, something even darker going on?
That's where things get even more interesting, and we'll get into that in a minute. But first, there's one more detail about the crime scene that you need to know. Something that adds another layer of horror to this already tragic story.
Okay, this is probably going to be tough to hear, but I'm ready.
When the police arrived, they found Shivani's infant son in the apartment. He had been left all alone, crying next to his mother's body.
It breaks my heart just thinking about it. The complete disregard for life, the utter lack of humanity. It's almost too much to bear.
It's an image that sticks with you, the innocence of a child next to such a brutal scene. I think it really shows the kind of people we're dealing with in this case.
Yeah, it's a really dark picture. So after this horrible discovery, how did the investigation go?
Well, at first there was a lot of silence and confusion. The police were under a ton of pressure to solve this high-profile case, but they were struggling to find any real leads. You have to remember that back then, forensic technology wasn't nearly as advanced as it is now.
Right. And I can only imagine the media frenzy surrounding this case, especially with Shivani's reputation and how shocking the crime was. Did all that pressure to find answers lead to any mistakes?
Unfortunately, yes. Initially, the investigation focused on Shivani's husband, Rakesh Bhatnagar. He was under intense scrutiny and had to go through hours of tough questioning.
It seems like we see that a lot in cases like this, the immediate assumption that the spouse must be involved. So how did the focus shift to Ravi Kant Sharma after 3 years?
It took a change in leadership at the Delhi police for the case to really pick up again. A new team reviewed the evidence and they noticed something important: phone records that linked Sharma to his associates around the time of the murder.
So the phone records were the key that investigators needed to start unraveling this whole mess. What did those records show?
They showed a pattern of communication that was way too frequent and suspicious to ignore. The timing of the calls, how long they were doing, the fact that they suddenly stopped after the murder. It all pointed to a coordinated effort to silence Shivani.
But phone records on their own wouldn't be enough for a solid case, especially against someone as powerful as Sharma. What did they do next?
The police decided to wait and watch. They put Sri Bhagwan and Satya Prakash under surveillance, hoping to catch them doing something incriminating or overhear a conversation that would implicate Sharma.
That was a risky strategy. A lot of patience and hoping those men would slip up. Did it work?
It did, but it took time. Months went by with careful observation, and just when it felt like they might be hitting a dead end, they got a break. Sri Bhagwan was overheard talking about the murder with Satya Prakash, and he confessed to his part in organizing the crime on Sharma's orders.
Wow, what a moment that must have been for the investigators, finally a crack in the case. What made Sri Bhagwan confess?
It's hard to say for sure what pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe he felt like he was trapped and decided to make a deal. But whatever the reason, his confession changed everything.
I bet his confession sent shockwaves through India. A high-ranking police officer, someone who was supposed to uphold the law, involved in a cold-blooded murder. Did they arrest Sharma right away?
Not exactly. When Sharma realized he was being investigated, he used his knowledge of police tactics to avoid getting caught. He went on the run, basically becoming a fugitive in his own country.
It sounds like a movie. A powerful figure using his insider knowledge to stay ahead of the law. How long was he able to stay hidden?
Sharma managed to stay hidden for weeks using his connections and his ability to blend in, but eventually the pressure got to be too much. The police launched a nationwide manhunt and the media coverage was relentless.
It must have been a tense time for everyone involved. Did Sharma finally turn himself in, or did they catch him?
They finally caught him in a pretty dramatic raid. You can picture the headlines the next day: high-ranking officer captured in murder case. It was a huge win for the investigators, but the fight wasn't over. They still had to prove Sharma was guilty in court, and that wasn't going to be easy.
Because he was a powerful man with connections and resources.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to go down without a fight.
Exactly. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched legal battles in India's history.
I can imagine a real clash between power and justice.
It was a major test for the Indian legal system. Could they hold someone like Sharma accountable for such a terrible crime?
And on that note, we're going to take a quick pause and come back to talk about that dramatic trial that had the whole nation on edge. So we're back, and now it's time to talk about the trial itself. This trial that had the whole nation captivated a powerful figure up against the pursuit of justice. What was the atmosphere like in the courtroom?
It was electric. The courtroom was packed every single day with journalists, members of the public, and of course, Shivani's family and friends. Everyone there was hungry for justice. You could just feel this weight of expectation, the hope that this time the system would actually work.
And the prosecution had a lot to prove right. They had to build a rock-solid case against Sharma, who had spent his whole career navigating the legal system.
Absolutely. They knew they couldn't make any mistakes. They had to dismantle Sharma's defense bit by bit and tell a clear and compelling story that would leave no room for doubt. Their strategy was actually brilliant. They started by laying out the timeline of everything that happened, meticulously connecting Sharma to the crime.
So they were establishing a foundation of facts, a framework for the more complex and incriminating evidence that was to come. What were some of the key pieces of evidence they presented?
Well, they brought out the phone records, of course, those calls between Sharma and his accomplices, the ones that showed just how much they were communicating leading up to the murder. And then there were the testimonies of Sri Bhagwan and Satya Prakash, who had both already confessed to their parts in the crime.
It must have been chilling to hear those testimonies firsthand. Did they directly implicate Sharma?
They did. Their accounts matched up perfectly. They painted a very clear picture of Sharma as the mastermind behind the whole thing. They talked about how Sharma had manipulated them, preyed on their loyalty and fear to get them to carry out his plan.
So the prosecution was building a really strong case. But what about Sharma's defense? What did he do to try and counter all this evidence?
Sharma, like you might expect, maintained his innocence throughout the whole trial. He claimed he was being framed by his political enemies, that this was all a conspiracy to ruin his reputation and career. He even tried to suggest that Shivani's husband might have been involved trying to shift the blame and create confusion.
Classic deflection tactics, trying to plant those seeds of doubt in the jury's mind. Did the jury believe his story?
No, they didn't. After weeks of intense testimonies and deliberation, the jury came back with a unanimous guilty verdict. It was a huge moment of relief for Shivani's family and for everyone who had been following the case. It was a victory for justice, even though it was bittersweet.
A long wait for justice, but a victory nonetheless. What sentences did they receive?
Ravi Kant Sharma, Sri Bhagwan Satya Prakash, and Pradeep Sharma were all sentenced to life in prison. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, paying for what they did. It sent a strong message that even those in positions of authority are not above the law.
This case wasn't just about one murder, though, was it? Shivani Bhatnagar's death really sparked a lot of conversations about bigger issues, didn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Shivani's murder became a symbol of the risks journalists face, especially those who challenge powerful people and expose corruption. It showed how vulnerable those who speak truth to power are and how much we need to protect journalists and whistleblowers.
Her story also raised some serious questions about the abuse of power and the potential for corruption within the system itself.
For sure, the fact that a high-ranking police officer was found guilty of orchestrating a murder shook people's trust in the institutions that are supposed to be there to protect them. It started important discussions about accountability, transparency, and the need for change.
So even though justice was served in this case, it also brought to light some really troubling things about the systems we rely on to keep our society safe. Shivani's legacy lives on, though, doesn't it?
It does. Her courage and her commitment to the truth continue to inspire journalists and activists all over the world. She represents how important a free and independent press is, and the power of speaking truth to power no matter the danger.
Shivani Bhatnagar's story reminds us that we can't become complacent. We need to stay vigilant, hold those in power accountable, and support the people who risk their lives to expose wrongdoing.
Very well said. This has been a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive, a reminder of the complexities of power, the importance of seeking truth, and the lasting legacy of those who fight for justice.
Thank you for joining us as we explored this dark chapter in India's history. And a huge thank you to our expert for sharing their insights. If this conversation has resonated with you, we encourage you to learn more about the work being done to protect journalists and whistleblowers.
And remember, a free press is absolutely crucial for a healthy democracy.
And don't forget to follow CrimePod Castle and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into the shadows of history. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep those candles of truth burning bright.